So things are working this time. I don't know what happened. I think I accidentally turned off my microphone as well. So not only did it not record the screen, like there was only one slide and nothing on the other side, and there was no audio either. So there was nothing really to look at, right? Even though it said it was 45 minutes long, I don't know what was going on with that. But this should be working now for today. So we left off talking about Giotto, and we were looking at the changes in style happening in Italian painting at the end of the 13th century on your right into the early part of the 14th century on your left. And we were focusing on the degree to which Giotto's style, the subject matter is the same, right? With some small alterations, more figures around the sides of the throne. The angels moved from the circles in the back to kneeling in the front. But for the most part, the subject matter is the same. But what's changed drastically, much more drastically, is the style. And we moved from a relatively flat conception of space on the right to a much more three-dimensional conception on the left. Everything from the modeling of the figures and that sort of duotone, gold and blue for the Virgin Mary's robe, to what we called chiaroscuro, right? A modeling in light and dark. And that Giotto everywhere, with the exception of maybe the gold background, which is still continued, everywhere else we've seen that Giotto is very much interested in not only three-dimensional quality, but a sort of a heightened sense of realism, right? And it's the first thing you mentioned, right, about the throne was how realistic it looks as well. And that realism extends to the way the clothing hangs off the figures. Look at the two figures in green on either side of the Virgin Mary's knees. And you can see how realistically the fabric seems to fold over their arms, right, and hang and drape. Whereas there's something quite artificial about the gold and blue or the gold and red by our anonymous artist on the right. Giotto has drastically increased the realism of the work. And as we were talking about on Monday, the things that we try to do in art history is explain what might have motivated these changes, right? What might have motivated the artist to make his choices. Certainly the choice of the subject matter is motivated by the fact that it was a church altarpiece. It decorated a major altar in a church, and it's huge. It's like about 11 feet tall, right? So it can be seen all the way from the back of the church, and the priest would stand in front of it, delivering the sermon and delivering communion, right? So that accounts for the subject matter. But the style is the other thing that we need to begin to account for. Let's see what I've got coming up here, right? Boom. Right, so we're looking at this, and then as another kind of altarpiece, we'll look at it a little bit more later, the Giotto that's down in the National Gallery, right? Same interest in realism, three-dimensional qualities, even though there's no setting, modeling in chiaroscuro. And then we started to talk about some of the symbolism, the tenderness of the holding the finger and the reaching for that rose, and how that's symbolic as well for the Virgin's role and her relationship with Jesus. Now, why does Giotto change style from those earlier works? That's the kind of question before us. One of the things we should talk about is where he was working, in particular in Italy. This is one of the things that may have motivated his change in style. He's working in the city of Florence. The city of Florence is different than many other cities in Europe. And in fact, this entire region in north-central Italy is very different from other regions in Europe in really one major way. And that is that the city of Florence was no longer governed by the medieval system of feudalism. Have you heard of feudalism before? High school history class? I know that's where I sort of learned about it. Feudalism is the old system of kings, right? Kings and nobles, so dukes, right, counts, and peasants who work underneath them. And it's all about political control and land management, right? A king has an oath of fidelity to his duke, right? The duke will fight for the king when necessary. The king will protect the duke where necessary. The duke then has land that is worked by peasants who he will protect, but the peasants owe basically everything they make back to the duke. Right? And under the feudal system, there is absolutely no way in which you can be born a peasant and end up anything else. Right? Hard work gets you nowhere. Right? If you're born a duke, you'll stay a duke. Right? You might become king if your older brother dies, because that's usually the case. The duke is the younger brother of the king. Right? But there isn't a whole lot of social mobility. The only kind of social mobility there was in the Middle Ages was if you could become a monk and move to that section, right? The religious sector. But that was about it for Western Christianity. Now, Florence is not governed by feudalism. Florence is independent from that structure. And relatively recently, around the middle of the 12th century, right, they become a modern city. And by that, I mean it's a city where hard work pays off, where your status in the city is entirely based on your success, right? They're capitalists. They're merchants. You sell a lot of works, you're going to make more money, you can buy a better house and live in a better part of town, right? This is not unlike now, right? A modern way of life. So this merchant society, we think, the historical community thinks, has everything to do with a sort of shift in style toward works of art that appeal to, that look more like they're an extension of our world. Because these are people that are dealing with our world in a more sort of down and dirty kind of way. Right? Getting their hands involved in the day-to-day activities that make them successful. They might want a different kind of art than the kind of art that had originally been made for the church, for kings. And oftentimes, altarpieces like this are supported by, paid for by, members of the local community, and then donated to the church. Right? So this change in style coincides historically with a change in political structure. And when you get coincidences like that, it's tempting to see connections. And this is certainly, I think, part of it. So that's one of our reasons why Giotto has a sort of radically new, three-dimensional, realistic style, is that the people that he's working for, many of them are interested in that kind of realism. The second thing that we can talk about when we talk about Giotto's change in style is a change in religious practice. Now, we already talked about a change in religious practice on Monday, when we talked about the fact that the Italians begin to make altarpieces in the middle of the 13th century, right, around 1230 or so. Right? That there was a change in religious practice that brought in the idea of using altarpieces as church decorations rather than wall murals. Right? Toward the end of the 13th century, or really kind of around that same time, we also see, particularly in Italy, another change in religious practice, a very dominant one. And that's the rise of the mendicant orders. Now, these are two new orders of monks. The followers of St. Francis and the followers of St. Dominic, both of whom lived in the early 13th century. You might have heard of St. Francis of Assisi. The current pope is named after him, right? St. Dominic, you may not have heard of as much. Both St. Dominic and St. Francis had, well, a lot of things they saw differently, right? St. Dominic was very much about protecting the faith, right? Francis in a different direction. But the one thing that the two of them shared was a sense that the old traditions of being a monk, monasticism, right, had sort of gotten outmoded in a certain way because of the new political structure, the interest in cities where merchants live, right? Now, when monasticism was first founded, the idea of being a monk was first founded, it was back in the 6th century, right, the 500s. St. Benedict, right, the Benedictine order was the earliest monastic order in Western Europe, okay? St. Benedict set up a system wherein men, exclusively, who wanted to devote their lives to God could put behind them all temptation. And the best way to do this was to leave the city behind and live together in the countryside in a monastery, right? And as they lived together as a sort of self-sufficient community, growing their own food, raising their own cattle, right? Maybe selling some things to the city if they needed to, like mustard or beer, right? They could then leave the temptations. They're not going to encounter people on the street that might tempt them to do bad things, right? Get rid of all temptation and focus entirely on their life of prayer. What St. Francis and St. Dominic did in the 13th century, in the early part of the 13th century, right, the early 1200s, what the two of them did was to realize that with this new political structure where people live in the cities, that's where they need to be. Because there's more to being a Christian than just your own relationship with God. You need to tell other people about your faith. Right? You need to try to preach and convert. So our two mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, house their monasteries in cities rather than in the countryside, so that they can reach out, so that they can have contact with this growing, successful merchant class living in the towns. And that means that both of them are orders that are not vowed to silence. They preach in the cities, on the street corners, spreading the message, and they preach in the local dialect. Because it does no darn good to tell people about your faith if you're doing it in Latin. They felt it was important to speak the local dialect, so they would speak the local dialect in Florence. Right? This raised some problems. In the countryside, you've got land. You can be self-sufficient. What do you do if you have a small monastery in a city? Stuck, right? They ended up having to ask for donations in order to keep the monastery thriving. And the word mendicant simply means begging. They are the begging orders. The orders that had to beg for a living. So they asked for alms. They asked for monetary support. Because they couldn't raise enough, because they had to go out and buy their food. Right? Okay. One of the things that comes out of this rise of these mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who were very powerful. And by the way, Santa Croce, the Holy Cross, that's what that means, in Florence, is the mother church of the Franciscans in Florence. Okay? That's their home church, and across town is the Dominicans' church as well. And the monastery was attached to the side of this. Right? Now, why is this important for John to change his son? When the Franciscans and the Dominicans went out and preached, one of their strategies for reaching people was to try to make the Bible story as relevant as possible to these people's daily lives. So not only are they doing it in a language they can understand, a language that reminds them of the world around them, but they're also telling them stories and embellishing the stories from the Bible, not in a way that's respectful, but also makes it so that when you see an image of the Virgin Mary, you understand that she's a woman like you. Or when you see an image of the life of Christ, you realize he's a man like you, not unlike you. Right? That there is a connection between you and these biblical figures from, at this point, 1,300 years earlier, 1,200 years earlier. Historians, again, have looked at this phenomenon in Italy and said, well, this is exactly what the paintings are trying to do. They're trying to make them like you. No longer artificial and removed and flat and schematic. These are an extension of your world. They relate to you. So we've seen in all these pictures where the Virgin looks out at us. She has her mouth open. She's speaking to us. She's breathing. She relates to Jesus as a mother and a child might relate with that tender finger grab that we see, right? There's a dynamic between them that a mother would recognize. So the rise of the Mendicant orders remains for us a very important way of explaining this sort of radical change in style that we're seeing at the beginning of the 14th century, right? Now, one other thing, Giotto's picture on the right from the National Gallery may have originally come from this church. We think it is. I mean, there's no smoking gun, but there's a lot of, what do I want to say? What do you call evidence that's not direct? Circumstantial evidence, right? That it came from this church, because our picture was one of a number of panels that were stitched together, side by side. And they've since been broken apart. They've been sawed up by a dealer somewhere and sold off, right, in a number of different directions. And so, okay, here it goes. Is that going to change? Yeah. So ours was the top center part of this. There were a series of saints on either side, at least this many. Maybe more, we don't know. 3 other panels survive that have the same framing as ours does, slightly smaller. And by the way that they're posed, I sort of put this together myself, right? But by the way they're posed, they're looking toward her, right? It would be unlikely that the 2 on the left would be on the right looking away from her, right? And there's a series of panels that are the same size that look like they might have gone on the bottom of it as well, which is common for this kind of articulated altarpiece in the 13th century or 14th century. And the crucifixion scene, this is Christ on the cross, that we see at the bottom here, has some people kneeling and praying at the foot of the cross, and they're not from the story. They're from contemporary times. And one of them is a Franciscan monk. So that leads us to think that Giotto's picture may have originally come from Santa Croce, because we know from other records that Giotto painted 5 different altarpieces in Santa Croce. And he also made frescoes, paintings on the wall, right, for 3 other chapels in Santa Croce. So Giotto seems to be deeply, deeply involved with the Franciscans. So if any artist is going to be influenced by this new interest in realism that they get in their preaching, if anybody's going to be influenced by that, it's Giotto. Yeah. So we've got 2 reasons why Giotto might have been adopting a more 3-dimensional and realistic style, right? Merchant class, patrons, changes in religious practice. A third reason is that the period that we're talking about, around 1300, we see throughout Italian culture an interest in their own past. In particular, an interest in ancient Roman culture. We see it in poetry. We see it in literature. We see it even in civics, in the way people approach their relationship to the city, to the community. And we see it in art. And that renewed interest in ancient Rome is what we call the Renaissance. The word simply means rebirth. Right? A rebirth of various aspects of culture from ancient Rome. And for Giotto, that means not that he's interested in Roman subject matter, not that he's interested in Roman gods or anything like that, although later Renaissance artists will be. What Giotto's interested in is Roman realism. This strong 3-dimensional modeling of the human figure, to where the flat surface seems to open up into space, where figures are solid and have mass and occupy a space within the picture. Giotto is reviving that idea. Right? So those are three different reasons that we can talk about with why Giotto's work really seems different from what had happened a generation before. Right? Things are changing in Italy. Right? The chiaroscuro we talked about on Monday is something that Giotto picks up directly from having looked back at ancient Roman art. Now we'll look at one other artist in the 14th century who's also part of this early Renaissance movement. Right? I call it proto-Renaissance because it's kind of a hiccup start. There's an interruption at the end of the 14th century that stops this before it picks up again in the 15th century. But the other artist from this time period who is pointed to as one of the early adopters of Renaissance art style, this three-dimensional realistic style, is Duccio. Right? Italian pronunciations, you'll get used to them, right? An I after a hard consonant makes it soft. Giotto, right? Duccio. Duccio is working very, very close to Giotto. He's not in the same city, although he does pick up a couple commissions in Florence. He's working in the city just next door, in the city of Siena, right, with a single N. And Siena, like Florence, is also a merchant city. So all of the same things that affected Giotto also affect Duccio, right? Working for mercantile clients, or at least working in a city that's very much defined by their interests. Working in a period with the mendicant orders on the rise, enhancing an interest in realism, and then also, of course, working in this early Renaissance period. Right? So Duccio is also picking up a sense of three dimensions. Now, he tends to fill more of the frame with figures tipping up the background, so there's not a lot of sky around it, but we still have angels crowded around either side, like we saw in Giotto's larger picture, and we have in the center of the image an image of the Nativity. Now, you're going to hear a lot of terms that are basically terms for events in the Bible in the first weeks of this class, simply because most of our works are paid for by the church, so they're going to show church things, right? The Nativity is the birth of Christ. That's what it means, right? Although it's not the actual birth of Christ. You know what I mean? It's not obstetric, right? It's the moment after the birth of Christ. And in this case, we see him already having been born, laying in the manger with the cute little ox and donkey, looking at him there and saying, "Where's our food?" Right? And the Virgin Mary, his mother, now on that unexplained red blob, right? Laying in front of him and looking down toward him, right? Again, a work from the National Gallery, one of our most important works, certainly one of our most prized works, because originally this was part of the high altar in the cathedral in Siena. So again, we talked about altarpieces, right? We saw two different kinds with Giotto. We saw the articulated multi-panel kind, and then we saw the one huge painting, right? This one is equally huge. I think it's something like 17 by 12 feet. The main, that part only, right? And at the bottom of it, there were a series of paintings, and at the top of it were a series of paintings that give us narrative, right? The central scene of the Virgin and Christ enthroned is just what we saw before with Giotto. Right? The Virgin in heaven surrounded by saints with Jesus on her left. And again, pretty much the same pose, right? There's the hand coming across, Jesus on her knee, looking out at us. She's looking out at us too. And that central scene is then enlivened by a series of stories across the bottom and across the top and on the back. There are 51 smaller panels that tell us the story of the life of the Virgin Mary across the top, the infancy of Christ across the bottom, then his adult life and his death on the back. So you have to imagine when this is placed in the church that it wouldn't be placed up against a wall, but rather away from it so that if there was no service going on, you could walk around the back. You could see the images on the other side. And Duccio, our painter, was commissioned by the city to paint this. And we have, this is nice for us, the contract, right? Between the city and Duccio, telling him, this is what we're going to pay you, this is what we want from you, this is the time frame in which we want it, right? And that dates the contract to 1308. That's how we know when it started, right? We also know from the records of the city of Siena that when Duccio finished it, there was a parade in town. It was a huge celebration because the Virgin Mary is the patron saint of the city. So they are particularly engaged with her, right? I had to look this up. The patron saint of Arlington, St. Thomas More. And we got one of the windows of him in the chapel. They're into her. They're totally into the Virgin Mary. And when Duccio finishes the picture, they close all of the stores in town. It's a holiday. And there's a parade route that leads from Duccio's painting studio, where the painting's been finished. And you have to remember now that the center part's 13. This is huge, right? With all the extra paintings attached to it. And these were sawn apart and sold off in the 18th century when they didn't care so much. Right? When it's finished, it comes out of the studio. There's this parade route with people crowded on either side of it. Right? We have that, right? Parade routes with people, banisters on the side. Every church bell in the town was ringing. And people in front of and in back of the altarpiece are carrying huge torches. So it's this massive display of pride in this work of art as it's marched from Duccio's studio through the streets of Siena and put into the church at the high altarpiece. Right? The high altar is the main altar, not one of the side chapels. Right? So this is a big thing for Duccio. This commission is just like, wow. And it tells us what we already know, which is that Duccio was easily the most important painter in town at the time. They would certainly not have given this commission to just anybody, right? He was an established painter, been painting about 20 years by that time, and this is recognition of his work up to this point. So the panel sat there until around the 18th century, the 1700s or so, at which point, when this style of art was no longer seen as all that valuable, different works were sold off because each of these are different panels. And different works were sent to different collections around the world. We got two of them in the National Gallery eventually. We weren't around in the 18th century, right? We picked them up. I think we got them from Russia, of all places, right? Is how they ended up getting here. But suffice to say that when the National Gallery opened in 1937, this was one of the crowning achievements, was to get part of Duccio's Maestà altarpiece. We'll come back to the Nativity in a second. The word Maestà simply means majesty in Old Italian. And you can see how it's very similar. Maestà, majesty, right? And what that means is it's an image of the Virgin in majesty, a virgin in glory, a virgin in heaven, surrounded by saints and angels. Arguably, that's exactly what Giotto's was, that we started off with today, that we saw on Monday. We could certainly apply that term to that painting as well, but this one is referred to as the Maestà altarpiece, and very few of the others are. And we can identify all the saints around them. I'm not going to go through them one by one, based on what they're wearing, what they're holding. All helps us to identify those different saints. And they are saints that were particularly popular in the city of Siena. Here's a close-up of the Virgin and Child, and you can see that Duccio, even though the paint has darkened a bit, we talked about that, fugitive pigment, right? How some of our raw materials in egg tempera will behave differently than others do. In this case, the blue has gone very, very dark, right? But you still get the sense from looking at the reds, the pink in Christ, some of the other figures, her throne, that indeed Duccio has also modeled this in 3 dimensions, using chiaroscuro. Right? He also signed it, and you can see along the base of her throne, there are words down there, as if inlaid into the red stone around the base. Can you see that? The bottom over here? And basically what it says is, Mother of God, Duccio signs it as it's a signature. And he signed as if he's praying to her. He says, Mother of God, please give your protection. That's not the right word. What's the word I want? Please give your favor to the city of Siena. Right? So they see this work of art as having a protective function. Please give your favor to the city of Siena and to Duccio, who painted you so nicely. Right? This is a little pat on his own back. Right? He says, actually a signed work of art, which is rare for this time. Right? None of Giotto's works have a signature. Right? We only know about Giotto's works being Giotto by people telling us about them, and then we can identify them based on those descriptions, people writing in the 14th century. But this one has a signature across the bottom, right? To Duccio, who painted you so well, right? So it's a bit of a sort of a pat on the back, but also the idea that painting the picture was for Duccio, and I think this is true for Giotto as well, was a good work. Painting the picture was a way of showing, demonstrating your faith. And that itself had rewards. So, like I said, it's painted on the front and the back. Some of the paintings from the back are missing, right? Some of the bits of the painting on the front and the back are missing. But originally, this is the way it would have looked. We picked up 2 of these pictures, right? We saw the Nativity. We'll come back to that in a second. We also have Christ calling Peter and Andrew to be his disciples, where he says, come, I'll make you fishers of men. And this is where they're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee, and you can see some cute little fish there in the water as well, right? Some of them looking right at you as Peter and Andrew look at Jesus. Right, so these are our 2 Duccios. Oh, it's not changing for me. Try it again. We're having that problem. There we go. These are our 2 Duccios in the National Gallery, both coming from the Maestà altarpiece. Right? Now, let's take a look more closely at the nativity scene. So that's the Virgin Mary in the middle, having just given birth to Jesus. Right? He's been laid in the manger. Christmas carols, right? Away in a manger. Blah 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 blah. There are other figures around them. We have angels up above on either side. Right? Who do you suppose that fellow is? The man in pink on the left, kneeling and looking a little firm. Who do you suppose he might be? Any guess? Okay. Let me ask you a question. Outright, and don't be embarrassed to answer. How many people here would love it if I just told you what the biblical story was because you don't know it already? Who's the Virgin Mary's husband? Joseph, right? And one of the things we know about Joseph from the Bible is that he was significantly older than the Virgin Mary. Right? He was kind of a ways along in years when they got married. Okay? So that's exactly how Duccio depicts him, as significantly older, right? And I think in the story and in images, the emphasis of his age is in part also to make us remember that he's not Jesus' biological dad, right? Because the Virgin Mary gives birth to Christ without having ever had congress with a man, right? They never had sex. So Joseph is kind of pre-Viagra Joseph, right? No way that he's the father. And you'll notice that Duccio kind of subtly puts him outside of the manger shed because he's separated from her, right? And that's kind of a shorthand for artists. They keep him a little bit apart from her because it's important that he is not part of what caused Jesus to be here, right? So there's our Joseph figure. And we can see the chiaroscuro that Duccio is modeling in. You also notice that Duccio's figures are a little bit more dainty than Giotto's had been. They don't sort of have the big burliness, boxy quality that Giotto's had. They're a little bit more lyrical in the way that they appear. Okay, so there we've got Joseph. We can see his halo with the gilding and the tooling we talked about before. Let's see who are these guys? Any guess? The shepherds. And how can you tell? They got sheep. Exactly right. They've got sheep. And a cute little doggy, too, right? I'm a big dog fan, especially dogs in art. I love cute puppies. And he's a very good dog, not like my dogs, right? He's not jumping up or anything. But they're sheep. And it's the moment when the shepherds are being told that Jesus has been born. So the angel, one of our heavenly choir on either side, one of them is talking to the shepherds, and even though it's abraded, right, it's been worn off, the scroll that's held by the angel in blue and purple would have originally had the words of the angel's announcement to the shepherds that the Savior has been born and you should go see, right? So this is the annunciation to the shepherds, is what it's often called. The shepherds, you can see, are again modeled well in 3 dimensions, and I love how he turns the back of one of the figures toward us. That gives it that sense of realism. They're not like staged like an old sitcom around the table where they're all facing you. Right? He's willing to turn their backs. Giotto does that too. The one in red is also a musician. That's a bagpipe he's holding in his hand. And that's something we see a lot in medieval and Renaissance imagery, is shepherds as musicians, right? And we find them also in medieval plays and dramas that were produced in the Middle Ages, where they're really, really bad musicians. They can't play their instruments, squawk, honk. And then the angel appears to them, all of a sudden they get it. They start to play pretty, tunes. So this is kind of a reference to that, right? They're hearing the message. They've been in the fields, biding their time by playing the bagpipes, and they're being told now, go see the Savior, who's just over here. So our picture, right, is picking up multiple scenes within the same frame. Right? It's not just one moment in the story, multiple moments at once. This leads us to the figures in the foreground. That's Jesus a second time. Jesus appears in this panel twice. Right? In this case, after he's been born, he's been handed off to a pair of midwives. Now, this is not in the Bible, right? We talked about how the Franciscans, the Dominicans, like to round out the stories with details that made it relevant, right? Understandable to people at the time. Well, the idea of having midwives, of course, is something for childbirth. Everybody would have figured that one out. In this case, there were numerous stories out there about midwives for the Virgin Mary, helped with the birth of Jesus. And that she indeed did hand him off to 2 midwives, and as the story goes, one of them had faith, and one of them did not. And the one who did not wanted, this is really strange, but this is true. There are these 13th century stories about one of the midwives doubting the virginity of the Virgin Mary. So she wants to do an obstetric check. Right? So she goes to check the Virgin Mary, and her hand withers because of lack of faith. And then Jesus heals her. So stories grew up around these, and this is a way of extending the biblical story in a way that made it more relevant to the viewers of the time. Right? Everybody who gave birth would have had midwives. Why not the Virgin Mary as well? Okay. So they're included there, and Jesus appears now a second time as they bathe him here. Right? So our image is more complicated than it seems at first, in that it's not simply a nativity scene. Right? It includes also the separate scene of the angel appearing to the shepherds, and it includes this third scene where Jesus appears a second time with the midwives. Right. Finally, I wanted to look at Giotto and Duccio side by side, because as I mentioned, Duccio doesn't really look like Giotto. They both have 3-dimensional qualities to their works, but Giotto has a sort of a bulkier, sort of hard-edged kind of style. Whereas Duccio's figures tend to be daintier, more porcelain-like, doll-like, longer, thinner fingers. And one of the things people often point to with Duccio is the way in which he loves long, calligraphy-like lines, such as the gold border of the Virgin Mary's blue robe, which if we go back an image, okay, we'll try to go back an image. Come on. look at the gilding on the edge of her blue robe and how at the bottom, by her knees, it comes down and does this sort of flourish down there. And as we think about that in Duccio's work, we find it everywhere. He's got this really delicate way. So even though both Giotto and Duccio are hallmarks of this new Renaissance style, right? This early Renaissance realism, at the same time, they approach it in personal ways. So when we talk about style, right, the way in which an artist paints, what distinguishes one work from another, one period from another, we can talk about style that's related to the period at hand, the new realism, but we can also talk about style that's related to a particular artist, Duccio versus Giotto. Now, let's see how I want to set this up. Simone Martini, on the right, studied under Duccio. He's another artist from Siena, and he was one of Duccio's pupils, right? Back in the day, the way that you studied art was not going to college and getting a degree. The way that you studied art was through the apprenticeship system, in the same way that Marymount's got all these internships, right? The whole idea is that you're getting some real-world experience to train you for a career. But in the day, in the 14th century, the way that you learned was exclusively through apprenticeship. So Simone Martini would have begun his career working in Duccio's studio, doing all the really grunt work, all the thankless jobs, like grinding up the rocks so that he could mix them in the egg, right? Sanding down the panel so that they could paint on it, right? Maybe even cutting the panels up themselves, although they might have bought them already pre-cut from somebody else, right? All the sort of grunt labor would have been done by Simone Martini, and as he gets older and older, he gets better and better, and he's finally able, when he's around 18 or so, to maybe 20, to go out on his own, right? Set up his own studio, which required a lot of money as well, so he had to save up, right? Simone Martini went through this process with Duccio, and there's a lot of similarities to their styles. If we look at the two Virgin Marys side by side, you can see a parallelism, right? He's picking up a lot of Duccio's style, right? Our painting on the right, which is in Florence, was commissioned to go next to the Maestà altarpiece. I'm going to draw something on the board, and I know this doesn't record well if I have a pen in here. And if I don't have a pen in here, I won't. Okay. You have to imagine the Cathedral of Siena being like this room, okay? With the altar on this end here where I'm standing, and the altarpiece, the Maestà altar behind me with all the different panels, right? And there were side aisles on either side, separated by columns, okay? So the main room here, set of columns there, and then an aisle out to the side, right? And past the aisle, there would have been side chapels that projected off this way, okay? And as you came this way to the end of the church, there would be the main altar dead center, and there was space on either side that had these recesses behind them. And what the city of Siena eventually did when the Maestà was installed was commission other works to go on either side of it, right? So the Maestà on the center and then other ones here. And because the patron saint is the Virgin Mary, each of them depicts the Virgin Mary as the sort of focal point. So Simone Martini's Annunciation scene is the scene that would have gone next to the Maestà, I think on the right, okay? On your left, right to the right of the altar. And it shows the moment when the angel, on the left, appears to the Virgin Mary to tell her that she will be the mother of God, right? The mother of the Messiah. Okay? So it's the announcement. That's what Annunciation means. The announcing of the birth of Christ. And the miracle by Christian theology is that by simply hearing the words, the Virgin Mary becomes pregnant. That's the moment the miracle happens, is when she hears the words. Right? That's the start of it. Okay? So that is in lieu of the standard practice. Right? And you can see if you look at the panel that there are on the background, right, upraised against the gold, Those are the words of the angel, going straight from the angel's mouth to the Virgin Mary's ear. Can you see them here? Right in there. Right? Those are his words. And they proceed out of the angel's mouth. And he says, the words are, they're in Latin here, but behold Mary, full of the grace, or behold Mary, full of grace, God is with you. Okay. Ave gratia plena, behold, full of grace, Dominus tecum, God is with you. Right? And that's what's inscribed, Ave, I can see it from up here, Ave gratia plena, right, Dominus tecum. There's tecum there. It goes right to here. So, by medieval theology, right, upon hearing it, she becomes pregnant. And when Simone Martini paints this, he gives us those words traveling from the angel's mouth to the Virgin Mary's ear. There she is. And there you can see the E-C-U-M, right, the last of that tecum word. And I want us to look for a second at her reaction, right? Because again, our artists of this period are trying to make this look increasingly realistic. But look at her reaction. How would you put that into words? How is she reacting to this message?
She looks like pretty upset.
It's kind of a human reaction, isn't it? It's not just you're just right? But there's something human about it. It's upset, perhaps. Other words we might use for that. Does everybody agree with upset?
She looks bothered.
Bothered, yeah. Well, she's been reading. You know, there's this thing that guys do, that they see a girl reading out in the park and they think it's okay to say, "What you reading?" Like you're not doing anything, you know? And that's sort of their reaction is like, leave me the heck alone, right? I'm reading here, can't you see? There's something really kind of normative about this. I also think she kind of looks skeptical. You know, there's something about it, it's just like, huh? And look at the body language. She's covering herself up, right? She's taking her robe and she's pulling it across her face because her room's been invaded, right? I mean, what would you do if some guy came into your room, I don't care how lovely, young, and blonde he might be, and said, "Hey, you're about to bear the Son of God, and I'm here to make it so." Right? Yay. Right? That's kind of a frightening thing. Now, Duccio is not at all being sacrilegious, right? But what he is doing is he's making it real, right? He's enhancing that realism. And I love that she's got her finger in the book. You can see the latches that would hold her book closed. You can almost see the words inside, right? I also love that orange brocading behind her that's draped over her chair. You'll notice that even though this is supposed to be her bedroom, right, she's still on a pretty ornate marble throne. Again, to suggest that she's the Queen of Heaven, right? Still got the blue on, the blue of royalty, the blue of faithfulness to the cause, the red of suffering, because she knows already what's going to happen to her son. Right? All of these things are still coming into play here. And she has that look about her son. Say what? Right? Look about her. With the brocading on the fabric, I want to point to something that's kind of interesting about Simone Martini, is that the city of Siena was a major textile center. Right? They bought and sold and made fabrics. And Simone Martini seems to be particularly engaged with fabrics. We see it in a lot of his paintings. It may have everything to do with the clientele. Directly between the two of them, and there you can see the word still, right, across the top, is a lily in a pot. Again, that interest in making it three-dimensional, the lily's growing up. The lily was a symbol for the Virgin Mary. A couple of reasons why it was believed to be the tallest flower. She's the greatest woman. Okay? Status, stature. The other thing is, they're white. And white was, just like it is today, the symbol of purity. Right? So we often see lilies at the moment of the Annunciation as a symbol of the purity of the Virgin Mary. And Simone Martini is no different than many other artists. the angel, and look at this, he's got Burberry cape on the back, right? That fine British fabric is what it kind of looks like in the plaid. Pointing toward God. God's up above, or right here in the center. We see the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down, surrounded by angels. The angel Gabriel is pointing up, right? I've come from heaven. And he's holding in his hand a laurel branch. Bay leaves, right? Laurel branch, which is a sign of peace, right? So the whole point, of course, of Christ coming to earth is that peace will come with this, right? Our conflict with God through our original sin will now be saved. Christ will bring peace to the earth, right? That's the message, at least. And that's what the angel has come now to present to the Virgin Mary, right? So this went next to the Maya stop. As you walked into the main church, the cathedral in Siena, right, off to the side of it. Commissioned from Duccio's pupil, his student, because Duccio by this point had passed away, right? Simone Martini made a number of images of this, and we're lucky to have one down in the National Gallery, a little image of the angel of the Annunciation. And this is tiny. The one on the right is an altarpiece. It's huge. It's bigger than we see here. It's a good 10 feet tall. This one is about like this, right? You could, if you could get away with it, you could pack it in under your coat. Right? It's smaller than the piece of paper you're writing on. Right? About half the size of that, of your stamp. The size of your notebook, right, is this. Which tells us something about it. It wasn't made for any altarpiece. There's no way you'd see this in a church, right? Too tiny. This was made for private use. For someone who wanted to pray at home. And as we look around the museums in the world, we find, in fact, that there's another image. Okay, come on. Another image of the Virgin Mary over in St. Petersburg, Russia, that has the same gilding and tooling on the background that was originally nailed, hinged to this. Right? Can I borrow your nose for a second?
Mm-hmm.
So this is originally you could have it like this with something on the outside of it. There might have been another painting on the back of it, or an inscription, or maybe just some marbleizing, right? Make it look like marble. And then you would be praying at home, and then the Virgin's here, and you're praying to this image of the Annunciation, right? Just like that. And of course, a dealer getting this work no longer being used for prayer gets it and says, "Ooh, I could sell one work of art, or I can sell two," right? Cuts it in half. Maybe even saws the panel this way, if there's something on the outside of it, and sells it off. So our work was originally a hinged work of art meant for private devotion, but obviously very similar to the angel and the Virgin Mary in the altarpiece. We're not sure of the date on this, right? It could be based on that for someone from Siena who wanted a take-home version of the altar, right, for use at home. The term we use for a work of art that's hinged with two wings is a diptych. Di, right, two. Ptik is Greek for wing. Two wings, right? Again, used for private devotions. Now we'll quit with one last bit. Simone Martini is an important artist, not only because he was asked by the city of Siena to make a work of art to flank Duccio's mud stuff. That in and of itself puts him on the map, right? But Simone's legacy, his greatest legacy, comes from something a little bit more tangential. Around 1340, Simone Martini moved from the city of Siena to the French city of Avignon, right, in Provence. I've been to Avignon, it's lovely, right? Plenty of reason to go right there. It's gorgeous, right? Lavender, sunflowers, good wine, sea breeze, blah, blah, blah. He had a lot of that in Siena as well. But he went to Avignon around 1340 for a very particular reason. Does anybody ever heard of the city of Avignon before? Historically?
Wasn't it under control of the Papal States?
Bingo! It was the home of the papacy, starting in 1309. One of my favorite historical stories, right? But in 1309, the papacy left Rome for about 100 years and relocated in the city of Avignon. So you can still go visit the papal palace in Avignon from the 14th century. The story behind it is all political. It is a really great story, right? It's full of intrigue. It's full of a pope being accused of sleeping with Satan by the French king, right? It's incredible. But the whole point is that the king of France wanted to get his hands on money that was being controlled by the papacy and especially by the Knights Templar, who were the crusaders who were in charge of the grave of Christ in Jerusalem, who charged people to come and see, right? And they were getting rich beyond compare, and the king of France wants that money, right? So he ends up wanting to sort of shut down the Knights Templar, and in doing so, he also wants to begin to control the papacy. So he has the Pope driven out of Rome, has him replaced with his own hand-picked Pope, right? He's sort of his puppet, Clement VII. And that Pope moves to Avignon to be closer to the French king. Okay? Once the papacy is there is going to be art made. Because it comes with all sorts of other things that we don't think about when we think of the papacy, at least not immediately, right? It's not just a spiritual body, right? The Pope had a court, quite like a feudal court, surrounded by dignitaries, diplomats, wealthy people, right? Bankers, merchants, all of whom are buying art. Simone Martini answers that call, if you will, right? He's going there to make a new career for himself in Avignon, working for all of this money that's recently relocated there as well. Now, why this is important for the history of art, and it's deeply important, is that when Simone Martini and other artists from Siena, primarily from Siena, Siena's art tends to be more elegant, decorative, and appealing to these wealthy people. When Simone Martini goes to Avignon, he continues to paint kind of in the same manner, right? This new realism, bright colors, sumptuousness, right? Details that's very appealing to the new merchant class. Right? He continues to paint in that same manner, and we find that all of a sudden, other artists start to paint in that same manner, and the style of art that was born in Florence and Siena, because of Simone Martini, spreads throughout all of Europe. So he starts working for the Circle of the Pope. The popes decide, we like this style, start to commission works of art that resemble it from Simone and from other people. Right? The King of France, who is now the puppet master of the papacy, right, looks at these new, elegant, groundbreaking works of art and says, I want something like that too. And all of a sudden we start to see works around the French king look like Simone Martini and Duccio and Giotto. And because the King of France is related by marriage to just about every other king in Europe, it spreads from him. Right? And almost immediately from the 1340s on through around 1400, we start to see this new proto-Renaissance style just go all over Europe. Whether we're in Czechoslovakia, modern Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Holland, France, Portugal, Spain, England, it doesn't matter. You see this everywhere. Right? It becomes the style of Europe. And we begin to refer to it, there we are, Papal Schism, Papal Exile, 1309, right? So you had that down. When this explodes throughout all of Europe, we call it the International Gothic style. Because the style that Duccio and Giotto had started, because of Simone Martini, had spread. Excuse me, there's a class going on in here?
Oh, there's.
Because of Simone Martini, the style that was born with Duccio and Giotto ends up spreading right throughout all of Europe. And that's what we'll pick up and look at, I guess, a week from now, right? We don't have any class on Monday because it's Labor Day. So we don't see each other for a week, and in a week we'll pick up with this, right? And look at how this style spreads throughout Northern Europe.